ANMAtalks is an initiative for sharing knowledge between students, staff and management of the Nordic and Baltic academies for higher music education and anyone else interested. Welcome to this 6th edition, ANMAtalks Transmitting Cultures in Higher Music Education, Cultural Appreciation or Appropriation. I want to say a very big welcome to our panel. It's so great to have you here discussing this, in my opinion, very important topic. Let's just begin by having you all introduce yourselves briefly. Ankna, would you like to begin?
Hello, good morning, everybody. I was hoping I wouldn't be the first one to introduce myself, but here we go. I'm Ankna Rokim. I'm currently doing my PhD at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland here in Glasgow. I am a singer, and my PhD looks at exploring the musical, cultural, and social identities of young Indians that are learning Western classical music. Apart from that, I'm also interested in quality assurance in higher education institutions, and I perform with a few ensembles and bands here. I've been part of the AC student working group, and that's where I've had the pleasure of meeting Camilla. So yes, that's me.
Thank you, Ankna. And Nadia.
My name is Nadia, and I hold a bachelor's degree in anthropology, and I'm a musician as well. And at the moment, I'm kind of haven't continued my studies. I'm planning to, but at the moment, I'm not. I'm a free bird, reasonably. And I think I'm here because I also think it's a really important topic, and I want to contribute maybe with some anthropological perspectives, having this kind of double background of both anthropology and music. I think it would be an interesting topic to chime in on. So that's me.
And last but certainly not least, Keld.
Hello, my name is Keld Hosbond. I can add that Nadia also plays a wonderful trumpet. And I'm the vice principal here at the Royal Academy of Music in Aarhus in Denmark. And I've been dealing with global connections for many years now, with a special interest in a sort of equality in global relations, and how to take that into the music academy sector. How can you act globally responsible in doing all our kinds of exchanges and projects and so on. So that's my main motivation for being a part of this talk. I'm not a specialist in cultural appropriation or anything, but I think I'll try to draw on my experience in the cultural exchange field.
Thank you so much. And we actually have the pleasure of having Nadia give us a little bit of context to the term cultural appropriation. So Nadia, the word is yours. Do you want me to slide your shares? Wow, share your slides.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yes,
definitely.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
On their way.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, in the meantime, I can say that I'm also not really an expert in this topic, but I guess what I can say is that I have some perspectives from the field of anthropology, which I'll try to kind of create some sort of framework with those kind of perspectives in mind, and maybe draw some parallels between like the field of music education and the field of anthropology and anthropological knowledge production, to kind of shed some light on some of the things that we might talk about later in this session. So you can go to the next slide, please, Camilla. So here I just put two kind of, after doing some web research, two of the descriptions of what cultural appropriation is, which I felt were that repeated themselves in several different articles. The first one says, cultural appropriation is the adoption of an element or elements of one culture by members of another culture. So that's a very short, concise description of what it is. However, I would argue that there are a lot of elements in this description that are quite hazy. First of all, of course, the concept of what is culture and how can you be a member of a culture in the first place, and what does this entail, and so we can get back to that. And the next description, I think, is a bit more detailed, where they say that cultural appropriation is the entire range of ways in which the cultural knowledge, traditions, and identities of minority peoples can appear to be exploited by outsiders. So there are different relations here, right? There is still the relation of an insider-outsider, which is, I think, a tension that we might talk about. And there's a more, I think, detailed description of what culture entails. There's both knowledge, traditions, and there's also sort of an identity, right? So I think this is also a description which has a bit more detail, and which we might get back to later. Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so in the description for this event, as we wrote, that part of the relevance of this topic is, of course, that we're living in a very globalized society right now. And I think globalization is also something that we can discuss. What does it even mean? And is it a new concept? Is it an old concept? How long have we been globalized? But I guess we can agree that globalization contains a lot of kind of double processes. There's both the process of like more interconnectedness, but also a process of more isolationism, right? So we find that while we are exposed to the wide diversity, I guess, of human life, we're also kind of seeing that certain identities become more clearly defined than before, as a reactionary process, I guess, to this this kind of interconnectedness. And it's in this context where the questions about cultural appropriations appear, right? Because interconnectedness also entails the kind of cultural exchange, which then sometimes can turn into appropriation. And we can talk about what makes the difference between exchange and appropriation later, because I think, as Keld also mentioned, this is two terms that are different but often intertwined somehow. A next reason why it's relevant to talk about this, I would argue, is that music is never neutral. It's not like music just appears in neutral ground, or that we can exchange music without ever exchanging anything else, right? Music is always embedded in social, cultural, and political contexts. And that's all the more reason to be aware of what kind of contexts are these, and what kind of political implications are also inherent when not just playing music, exchanging music, transmitting knowledge about music to each other. So there's always going to be these political contexts, which also entail some power dynamics, I guess. And I think it's important to mention that cultural appropriation takes place, or the conversation about it also takes place in different contexts. Sometimes it can be a very polarized context, and sometimes it can't. And I think what I'd like to kind of encourage us to do in this talk is to more clearly like delineate what is the context in which we as musicians or as music educators operate in when we transmit knowledge about music from other cultures. I'm not personally embedded in a music educational institution, so this is something which perhaps some people in the others in the panel, or maybe those of you who are listening and would like to contribute might have some good perspectives on this. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. So yes, I hope, given what I've been talking about, that today's conversation won't be so much about like do's and don'ts, like this is what we can do and this is what we can't do within this field, but more a conversation about how we can kind of gain a respectful and also hold ourselves accountable to when we transmit music with cultural significance, I guess it would be a way to say it. And like I also mentioned before, this process of transmitting knowledge about music entails, you know, questions of authority and power and agency, right? in what way are we claiming an authority when we stand as music educators, educating about music from a certain culture? What position are we in when we gain that knowledge in the first place? And what kind of spaces are available for agency, not just for our students, but also for the people whose music we are exchanging with or transmitting somehow. And again, I'll just get shortly back to this idea that I would argue that the whole concept of appropriation is not an exchange, because an exchange is something that's reciprocal. Like you give and you take, there's like a back and forth relation, whereas appropriation implies that it's more an adoption, or sometimes some people would argue it's a form of theft, right? You take something without giving credit back, without giving anything back. So I think that's the important distinction to make. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. So what I'm saying here is very much kind of colored by my anthropological background, and the field of anthropology, especially in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, experienced kind of an existential crisis in a way, because what we do as anthropologists is very similar, I think, to some forms of musical exchange, right? It's that we observe, or the idea was that you would go somewhere, you would observe something, and then you would write it down and then kind of transmit that knowledge back home. And during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there happened this kind of crisis, right? Where all of a sudden, and this was especially fueled by the picture you see on the left is a picture of the book Orientalism. This book was really, really important in kind of shaking up the whole field of social science, especially also the field of anthropology, where all of a sudden you realize how or with what authority do you claim the right to be able to represent something about someone else? What kind of authority is it that you kind of claim? And I think that the critique that was very important from this book, Orientalism by Edward Said, was that Western representations of or systems of knowledge about especially the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, kind of essentialized these cultures and the people that inhabit these areas, both with positive and negative stereotypes, but were ultimately linked to imperialism and colonialism. Even after, like in the post-colonial period, knowledge about these areas was so deeply affected by imperialism and colonialism, and there wasn't any reflection from the point of the observer, from the objective Western male scientist, that they were affected by this context with which they made their knowledge. And another important kind of body of work that came after that was Leila Abulurud, American Palestinian anthropologist who used Edward Said's critique and kind of used it to criticize the concept of culture in itself. She said, like, the concept of culture that we use relies on this same form of essentialization, this same sort of generalization about one culture or people who inhabit a culture as, and it made it inherently something other, something that we that is different from where from the West. The East will always be different from the West, for example. And most importantly, I guess this concept of culture robs people of agency. It says culture is like something that we can clearly observe, we can clearly delineate. It determines people's actions somehow, and yeah, it creates this idea of timelessness, or of that something is frozen in time, especially whatever is not Western is kind of frozen in time in some way. So that's like a simple way, I guess, of saying it. We can move on to the next slide. So what do we gain from these kind of critiques? I guess the first thing would be that we gain a kind of reflection on our own positioning when we enter any given field. And I would argue that this is important not just for anthropologists, but also for musicians, also for any person really who engages in what we might call intercultural exchange, would need to reflect on what position they take when they are in this kind of, when they are in this encounter that an intercultural exchange is, right? So this is one of the first things we could discuss. There's also understanding that culture is a dynamic process, that it's not something that we can go and observe, or that's something that just exists, but it's something that is also constructed and reconstructed all the time. And within this kind of idea about what culture is, there's also questions of identity and identity construction, that you understand yourself through constructing kind of ritual practices or other kind of practices that you then define as cultural, because this will give you some sort of idea about your own identity. And in this, there's also boundary making, right? In order to understand what you are, you also kind of understand what you're not. So there's always this kind of tension between insider and outsider, which I also talked about in the beginning. However, to claim that culture really doesn't exist and it's just something we make up, and that it could be anything, would also kind of be a shame, right? Because there is culture and cultural identities, or we need to acknowledge the significance. What can it mean for someone to have a cultural identity? And understanding this significance can help us also understand why is it that cultural appropriation can be hurtful, not just because it can generalize or can become, it can also kind of, there is a significance and a realness to the ownership claims of cultural elements that we see in this process. And I think maybe that would be it. I mean, I have some examples, like we can talk about some examples, but I feel like it might not be so relevant, really. I think I covered what I wanted to cover. Can I ask you just quickly to go to the next slide, Camilla, so I can see? Yeah, I guess these are questions that we can think about or talk about later. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was amazing, and it gave a really good overview, I think, of what we're talking about here in a very clear and, it is a very complex topic, but you made it very clear what the elements could be in this complex topic. So thank you so much for that. I will stop sharing my screen, and then I would like to ask the rest of the panel, Keld and Ankna, do you have any immediate reflections on what Nadia has shared with us now?
I just want to say that it was a really, really good introduction to the topic, and I think a very fruitful introduction to our talk.
Yes, I was just, I thought as well to kind of talk about these subjects that can be quite tricky to talk about in some ways, and in some ways actually not that tricky to talk about as well. But I think you kind of perfectly got that balance. Also, this is not a feedback on your presentation. Your presentation was excellent, but I love how it's turned into a feedback. And it's funny because when you said Orientalism, I'm like sat with one of these copies of Side's book for my own research. So yeah, no, thank you for sharing and your research so far on this very, very interesting subject. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe a place to start from could be going a bit more into why you here in the panel find this topic relevant and how you see it maybe also reflected in your own work, how you've come into contact with the topic apart from today. and you're allowed to just speak when you want to.
Okay.
Well, do you want to start, Ankna?
No, you go ahead. I'll follow you.
Well, I can say that for me, it's of course it's my main driver in the music education business is actually to find out how cultures interact and meet. And for that reason, I think it's extremely important to be sensitive to the connections between cultures in the different meeting points we have. And it can, when we define culture, that's a really, really big thing to go into that field, because you can spend the rest of your life trying to define what culture is. But nevertheless, when I mean culture here, I mean different cultures of the world with basically the many different ethnic divisions of the world, and the different cultural expressions they enhance. So the meeting points are important, and I think also the connection to the bigger topic of identity politics is it's important to establish the connection between the whole enormous discussion of identity politics at the moment, and try to see how does the discussion of cultural appropriation fit into that bigger discussion. And for me, it's like the big umbrella is that we are talking about all kinds of identity politics. It can be gender, which is very big in the Nordic countries at the moment. It can be the concept of sexuality and how you fit in with your different genders. It can be religion, which has always also been huge during the last 10, 20 years. And of course, it can be ethnic background, race. So, and I think when these years, all the cultural institutions, especially in Europe, but I think all over the world actually. But I know mostly stuff about the Nordics at the moment, and it's huge. Just in Denmark, it has been an overall arching topic for the last 2-3 years, and it is something that we see students in the streets demonstrating something we haven't seen since the 60s actually. So this is something that is really close to the hearts of the young generation, which is good. And very often it's about Me Too and gender and so on, but it is also about the cultural appropriation discussion. So I think there is a link to this that we need to see. It's a bigger trend, it's a mega trend, and it's a part of that discussion. And for me, if I want to boil it down to one word, it's about respect. It's about how do you respect other people than yourself, not coming from the same background, having a different approach, a different take on what it means to be a human being. And that respectfulness is something that we should dig deeper into. That is, no matter what we're talking about, sexuality, sex, gender, religion, age is another thing, class, socioeconomic divisions of the world. It's a sensitivity towards what does it mean to be in other people's shoes, so to speak. And when we talk about cultural appropriation, that's sort of the opposite. That's if you don't have that sensitivity, then you end up in all kinds of disastrous situations where you steal stuff from other people without giving back, as Nadja beautifully said. And you may think, oh, we are so advanced here in the Nordic region, we don't do that. Well, I would claim that maybe it happens every day in the music academies all over the region, because we are unaware of the fact that what is hurtful to you is not the same as what is hurtful to other people. So yeah, now we have a special responsibility. Of course, we, being a former colonialist nation in Denmark, for instance, same for in most other European nations. We have some special responsibilities. For instance, being a Dane, I see some different positions to Greenland and the Faroe Islands, for instance. We actually still in a bit of a colonial situation, and we have a strong collaboration with both Greenland and Faroe Islands. And every time I work together with them, I get reminded that there's something here we need to be very sensitive about. It's not just what most Danish people, they tend to think that, oh, we have a shared royal union consists of Denmark, Greenland, and Faroe Islands, and it's totally equal. There's no problem. But when you dig just a little bit under the surface, you see that there are actually still huge challenges and problems, and you have to be extremely sensitive by working with these areas. Just one more example, then I'll hand over to Agnar. But that is, for instance, working with at our academy, we have a study line. I see some of the names here today. Maybe study there. It's what we call the rhythmic music and movement study line. They have a particular interest in West African and Cuban music genres and styles, and I sense that there is a growing sensitivity to how do they actually deal with those traditions. Now I'm just mentioning this as an example because there could be hundreds of other examples. But how do you actually deal with doing West African music and dancing on a daily basis as your main field of interest in your musical profile, and being respectfully enough to recognize that this is actually something it's a gift you have been given from other parts of the world. And as Nadia said, it's not static at all. It's very dynamic, and cultures are changing all the times, and we need to dig into the concept of authenticity later. But anyway, it's just something that you have to be really aware of and ask yourself questions all the time. How does this other culture affect me? And do I actually step on somebody's toes when I perform the music? Could there be religious elements in it, for instance, that I'm not aware of? All that kinds of questions. And it's a huge discussion. And now I'm going to take a break and hand over.
Yep, sorry, we both unmuted at the same time. Yeah, thanks for sharing your views, Keld. I think based on like literature there's out there, there's not a lot of literature actually around cultural appropriation, as you would know, Nadia. There are some key literary books, but I think there's not enough done in this particular area. I have a friend from Brazil, she's a dramaturg, and she says she doesn't believe in cultural appropriation. She's like, no, cultures are borrowed from each other for a very, very long time. But that's her view. But I have a few things that I thought I'll talk about today. I think one of the key words that you did mention in your presentation was about dominant culture. So it's about which culture is dominant and what we talked about colonization, and you also mentioned that, Keld. But I think there's to do the work around decolonization or talking about post-colonialism, etc., is going to be a lot of work, and I'm afraid it's not. It's a great. Sorry to sound negative. It's a great thing to have this conversation, but I think it's going to be a lot of work. So we have to roll our sleeves and actually dig into that, and not just be like, what shall we do? How shall we do it? Because it is over a long period of time that we've come to this stage, and there has been a lot of events in history that have led to this. So I think conveniently using the term borrowing is perhaps not apt, and especially talking about performing arts. I think in higher education, music institutions, we have a very big responsibility, because if we're taking another culture without truly understanding what it is, not only is it harmful or disrespectful to the culture you're borrowing it from, but it's also disrespectful to the people that we're sharing it with, without them realizing. And so I think as music educators, we do have a very, very big responsibility in that regards. Sorry, my points might be a little haphazard, but these are just like notes I took while speaking, while listening to Nadia. I think we've spoken about power balance. With which culture does the power lie with? I think that is a very important thing to always think about when exploring other cultures. Awareness in terms of the terminology used, the language used, the styles used. There's so much to do. I think for me personally, this is something that I have faced coming from India to the UK, and I growing up in India, of course, like growing up among a billion people, like you don't think about these things, but actually even in India with certain communities you can culturally appropriate culture from other Indian communities, which is also, so even in India and the minority cultures, as we put it, there is also a lot of cultural appropriation happening there as well. But when I came to the UK, and then it was especially within music, and it's like, oh, this Indian music I listen to, and I'm like, yeah, actually that comes from this part of India, and this is what it means, etc. So I think it's not just conversations and doing the research of where these different styles or music come from, but it's also actually about financial gain. Why are we using this style of music while we're performing? Is it actually to understand the culture truly? What is the intention behind it? And I know that's a very gray area, because you can always say like, oh, but my intention is to respect. But like where we don't have an intention police here. So I think, but that is one of the key things to think about while performing music from other cultures as well. Are you doing that to just fill your pockets, or are you doing that because you really appreciate that culture? Um, Again, that's a gray area that needs to be picked out. It's not going to be easy, but definitely that needs to be done. And Also, we talk about West and East, and especially with like literature around Orientalism as well. But there are some scholars who talk about the North and South divide as well. And what does that entail in terms of cultures and mixing cultures, etc. But my key thing, I'll stop now, is, well, before I stop, actually, that another thing I'd like to talk about is when we are appropriating other cultures, what we're doing is we're actually glorifying stereotypes, which is very harmful to the cultures involved in it. And yeah, no, just to finish off before we go on and talk about other things, is I have forgotten it, but I will come back to it when I remember it. But yeah, sorry, there's just so many thoughts to actually pick out. And the thing I want to say is that it's just going to be a lot of hard work, and we just need to embrace that and move beyond conversations at some point. But yes, I will now mute myself.
Thank
Yeah,
you
I
so
just
much.
was, yes,
No,
thank you
please,
for all
Nadia.
those, yeah, thank you for those great comments. And I also just, yeah, want to, or just also add another comment to what you're saying, Ankna, is also that, like you were saying, stereotypes can also, I mean, and I think this is something that is often overlooked, at least in a Danish context, not something that we talk so much about, but stereotypes are harmful whether they're positive or negative, right? Like we talk a lot about negative stereotypes, and we have to, but positive stereotypes, and this is also a huge part of Orientalism, for example, is that positive stereotypes are also are still generalizations in a way that can be very, very harmful, and can lead to this kind of exotifying something, or talking about authenticity, for example, as this kind of thing that some people have this authenticity, and authenticity becomes a term that in itself also becomes some sort of positive stereotype that locks or freezes people into a situation where they don't really have the agency to break out of this stereotype somehow. So I just wanted to add that point, because I think it's really, really important what you're saying. Yeah, that was just a short comment on my part. Yeah.
If I may, just just talking about, for example, one of the biggest things when you look up cultural appropriation online is talked about black hair, and how pop artists and celebrities tend to do that from time to time, and are told not to do it. But that's because, but you could make the argument like, oh, but we're like celebrating somebody's culture. But it's not celebrating somebody's culture when women from the black community go to work and they're not allowed to have their hair done as how they would traditionally have it, or they don't have the freedom to do that. That's not acceptable. Sorry, my connection was unstable. Did you get that?
Yes, it went through.
Yes, so that's not acceptable. Yeah, thank you. So that's not acceptable. So I think that that's where you kind of realize that, of course, we don't live in a world where everybody is equal. That's a whole different discussion about equality, diversity, and inclusion. That's another 5 ANMA talks after this, I'm guessing. But I think for this particular thing, but what you mentioned about stereotypes and kind of locking them into that, that's how they identify, that is their identity, putting them in the box. Because I think, Nadia, you also mentioned about the fluidity of culture and how there is no one set thing under culture.
And I think also another point which I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about is, because I saw someone, I know it's maybe not time for questions, but I saw someone just asking about how we work with this subject in our music educations. And I think, again, in a Danish context, I realize that a lot of these discussions on on post-colonialism and our colonial history as Denmark's colonial history as a nation, and all of these entailing kind of I guess these entailing discussions and protests, and also there's a big attention to this in, for example, the art academies. You'll find a lot of art students, and there was different kind of political actions that were taken, and it became a huge political debate. There was a bust of some Danish king that was thrown into a river, and it was a huge discussion. And I was wondering, like, how come this conversation takes place in the art academies and doesn't necessarily take place in the same way in the music academies? And of course, there's something to do with also the history of the topic, right? There's a lot of art history that is very colonial. Like if you go to some of these old or exhibitions with artists who drew from who painted from the Middle East, for example, or there's a lot of, I think there's, my point I think I'm getting to is, I think there's something to do with when it's something visual and when it's something that is a commodity that you can touch. The conversation is very, very critical somehow, or like somehow you feel the urgency of needing to talk about this subject, because seeing something in a museum put in like a glass box really shows you like, wow, okay, I can, if you are the least bit like concerned with colonialism and have looked into post-colonial literature, you will see this kind of, the visual aspects of art exhibitions can be very, very striking. Somehow you notice very much how these practices are somehow still colonial in a way that you don't really with music, or that's at least my view. And I'm curious with like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is like whether music is also a commodity in the same, because like you were saying, Ankna, there is, the question of financial gain is very, very important in this question, right? Because this is one of the things where one of the consequences of appropriation is when there is financial gain on one part that isn't somehow reciprocal, right? And financial gain, that made me think of commodification. This is why I'm going into this whole, I don't know if the threads, I'm able to connect the threads somehow, but I'm trying to to collect my thoughts on how is music also a commodity somehow, and how is there financial gain in this, and how is it similar somehow to art, but also invisible in some way. It's not visual. So somehow I think we're not able to see the dynamics as clearly as if it was things. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just a comment that, yeah, I think this is really to the point, what you're saying here. I think I've been thinking the same thing. Why is this discussion so heated in the visual art and not so much in the music sector, at least not in the Nordic countries? But, and I tend to agree that it is because it's material. It's much easier to relate to. And maybe one more thing, that there's a certain, now maybe I'm stereotyping, but the fine arts sector, they are very much always looking to the future, trying to see how can we navigate and be critical towards the present art stage. We want to revolutionize it and make something new. Whereas the music sector in general, and this is very general, tend to be a bit more conservative, maybe a bit more backward looking. That might be a part of the reason also why the discussion is not so heated. And but nevertheless, it is getting more heated than it was just a few years ago. And we have started discussing it also on management levels in the different academies. Maybe also because we see that this is something that is of big interest of the students. So we have to sort of get it out in the open and discuss it. I heard an interesting example of a classical conductor, a Danish conductor who was touring in the US with some romantic classical music, and they put a nice program together, performing an inauguration of some sacred Indian land in the US, native Indian, and they performed a nice concerts. But then afterwards, some of the local people, they came to him and said, "Are you aware that this is one of the most holy places in the US when it comes to the slaughtering of the native Indian people? And you just performed the slave master's music on this place. It was really inappropriate." And he didn't have a clue about what he had been doing, because he, this takes this great sensitivity towards how does the music you perform or compose or transmit, how does it relate to the place and the people you are interacting with. And of course, that made him reflect a lot. Okay, what am I actually doing? So this is not just a thing of rhythmic music, for instance. It's not only about jazz, blues, reggae, whatever. It is about all sorts of music and the way it has been composed in the spirit of the composers, the performers, and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of things about why, especially within the Western, the classical music kind of world that we sit in, this discussion isn't as urgent because it also sits very much within class in the communities, and therefore there is this this whole idea of not wanting to engage with these difficult conversations, because a lot of it is actually accepting the colonial past, acknowledging it, and trying to make amends for it, which is going to take time, money, and effort. One of the questions that was asked about how do we incorporate that into teaching, I think if you are engaging with music from other cultures, also talking about financial gains, actually get a specialist from that. Now that things are online and things can be more accessible, get a specialist from that culture who can actually talk about it with authenticity, if we're going to use that word again. But I think so then you are actually paying for research to be done, and you're not kind of just trying to understand this music and representing it in a way that you're experiencing it. Of course, you're part of the experiencing of that culture for sure, but I think it's about making sure these communities are benefited with it as well. And talking about music like jazz, reggae, blues, etc. If we're talking about this is a thought. Work with, like, stay with me here. If we're talking about accepting musical styles, we should also see how we're actually accepting people into our communities. And I think you can't have systemic racism, but be like, oh, but we want to learn more about jazz or we want to learn more about blues. I don't think that works. It is a process that is embedded so deeply in our community that needs to be uprooted from across, like, yeah, the roots have spread like far and wide. So I don't think it's just like, oh, but we just want to talk about music and we can just ignore, but actually it is way deeper than just how can we pay a community for them to share their music. Sorry, I hope that made sense.
I think you have an important point there, Ankna, with the we just want to talk about music, or we just want to play. Can't we just play? And yes, we can, but I think I wrote down a couple of notes as well. One, empathy takes effort. It's not easily done, and understanding takes effort as well. And I think it's not only understanding what you're doing kind of in the moment, how you're playing this blues tune or how you're playing this jazz tune, but what does it mean for you to play it? What did it mean for those who came before you to play it? And that, of course, also calls for instance, in the main instrument teaching, some conversations about what is it that we're doing here. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher always has to be a specialist there, but you know, it just actually inviting the conversation into the teaching room at all is definitely a starting point, even though I agree with you in terms of hiring specialists, Ankna, definitely. But you know, if you imagine it in a day-to-day teaching where you might come across a lot of different areas, I think there's an underlying mindset of what are we actually doing here that should be definitely at the core of teaching, for instance, main instruments. Keld, did you have a comment as well?
Yes, actually I have a few, but I'm thinking about, somebody wrote in the chat that how are you dealing with this in the music academies? And well, I'm not sure I can answer that question because I don't know how much is actually happening in different academies, and I'm not even sure how much is happening at our own place here. But I can say what I would like to happen, and I would like to see that we have an awareness discussion taking place at many levels. In many of our schools, we have introduced boards of equality or gender, identity politics, as I mentioned before. And I think very often the topic of Me Too and gender, at the moment, it sort of blurs for the other bigger discussion when it comes to other inequalities. So I would really love to see those discussions being broadened a little bit, so we don't only focus on one aspect of diversity. And I think this has some quite big implications, because then you also have to talk about curriculum. How do we actually, where do we actually talk about these things during studies? Do we need to put up new electives, for instance? Do we need to discuss with the teachers how to attack this question and how to deal with it? I would also say, for instance, when we work with international projects, maybe we need to have a specific project on this topic. Sometimes it can start raising awareness on a larger scale. And I haven't seen the first international project in this field in the music business yet. So maybe there's something to be done. Yeah.
Ankna, I saw you raising your hand. Sorry, Nadia.
Yeah, no, Nadia, you could go and I'll go after you, please.
All right. I just, well, there are two comments in the chat. I don't know if people can see them right now. First, there's a question from Jesper saying, being a Dane, it's difficult to identify a genre of music that's endemic to Danish culture and thereby not possibly affected by the pitfalls of cultural appropriation. That's one part of the question. And I thought it was, I just want to kind of highlight it because I think it's very interesting. And I think as someone else also comments underneath, this is a very, this idea that, well, as Danes, we don't have this thing that's endemic to our culture, but other cultures do, is a really interesting thought, because I think you'll find that a lot of people, if you ask them, like, what's endemic to your culture? I mean, some people will, of course, have answers to that, but I think there's a typical kind of presumption that some cultures are more cultural than others, if that makes sense. Somehow, Danish culture isn't so cultural, or like there isn't really that thing that kind of signifies us, but of course Egyptian culture, of course there is something that's classical Egyptian culture where you're like, well, I mean, we're 100 million people. Like there's a difference there, right? Whereas, I mean, and of course, yeah, I just think that that's a really interesting idea to kind of, because it's very present in this question of cultural appropriation, I think, is that a lot of people are saying, well, we want to use these elements because we don't have anything like that. And again, this isn't a question of not being able to borrow or share things from between cultures. But now I'm saying several things at the same time. But yeah, I just think it's a very, very it's a very present presumption especially in Denmark that I think is very interesting. And I think Simon I think is the one who wrote a comment directly underneath that says, you know, most people being part of a majority culture in some contexts are not used to the expectation that they will be able to represent their culture somehow. Whereas being a migrant, for example, or being part of a minority culture, you're very much used to always being confronted with having to represent something that's much bigger than you and that you can't possibly even try to represent. So it's interesting to kind of, see those two things next to each other somehow. And I just also want to repeat again that of course we're talking about all the pitfalls somehow, all the dangers of cultural appropriation. That's not to say that there can't be sharing, or that we can't, like your friend you mentioned, Ankna, in the very beginning, who says, well, cultures have always taken from each other, and that's true. Like there is also, to a certain level, of course, there will always be exchanges between cultures, but it's I guess the question of whether it's sharing or taking, or where credit is due, or what kind of knowing that you can harm and trying to do it in a way in which you don't harm, more than just talking about that your intention was pure, your actions have to be so as well somehow.
Yes, I completely agree with, and then there's also another question in the chat from Sophia about this. There's a lot of talking, but maybe we need to move beyond talking. And I agree with that. And one place you can start being a bit more action oriented is in the money discussion. When you engage in projects with other cultures, we have to be aware that it's not only a question about respect. It is definitely also a question about respect, but it is also about resources, material resources. So if you engage in a mutual project, you think everything is fine, you are doing cultural exchange and it looks really good. On the surface, everything is equal, but you have to look a bit deeper than that. Is the money distribution also equal? Do you actually leave a material footprint in the project that is beneficial for the other part? This is something I also sometimes have to look in the mirror and ask myself, do we do this, or does it just look good on the surface? And then you go home have been doing a great project in Africa, and you come home and feel good about it. But what material footprint did you actually leave behind? And that is something I think we can, being rich, wealthy Nordic countries, I think we definitely have a responsibility here that we need to look into.
Thank you, Keld. Sorry, Sophia. I wish I had a book that I could just give you, like, hey, let's just do these things and let's not do these things. But I think apart from conversations, like I said, countries that do sit in the West have more than just a responsibility of acknowledging colonial past. It's not easy, but it has to be done, and changes that need to be done actually. It's like okay, I'm just gonna put climate change in there because the next COP is in Glasgow. Just gonna put that in there. But I think when we talk about climate change, it's about how individuals are made to feel that they're responsible for the climate, but actually it's the big corporate companies that are way more responsible for what's happening to our climate today. And I think this guilt that we're not doing enough as individuals comes again into this whole we can talk about capitalism and what it means to capitalize on other cultures as well, in terms of music or fashion or any other kind of sphere. So I think there's that discussion that needs to be had as well about capitalism and what that means for cultural appropriation. But I just wanted to say it has to be done across all not necessarily hierarchical structures, but all structures within music institutions, to actually have a think about this, because this needs to be embedded in the actual core value of each institution and what they represent as a community that celebrate culture and art and music. So I think it is definitely not just down to one teacher in a classroom with their students, but actually the power lies with everybody in that community. So it has to be a collective thing.
I see that Marie raised her hand. Marie, you're welcome to have the word. Just remember you're being recorded.
Yeah, it's okay. I tried to write, but I was walking at the same time, so it was a bit difficult. Just wanted to thank you so much. Speaking of action, I'm on Sunday traveling to the Sami University in northern Norway with 25 choreography students from Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. And I feel like we're really much on our toes about this subject. And I really found it interesting. And I wanted to hear your thoughts relating to you mentioned bringing in experts from the field, and we're really trying to do that in the program. At the same time, I really feel like it's a balance between also being able to be uneducated in a way and try to go somewhere and learn something. And I feel sometimes that especially the students who are so aware of this can be in some situation even a bit paralyzed and don't want to go there and don't want to engage with this because it's so difficult and they feel so much guilt. So I was just curious about how you see that. I'm an international coordinator, so I organize all these things on a very practical level, and I also work with Keld. And I'm just so curious about like how can we continue practicing and also learning and be curious and be stupid because that's also part of a learning process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria.
Great.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I don't have like an exhaustive answer. I think Keld and Ankna are probably more qualified for that, but I will say that like in anthropology at least, there's like this big, we talk a lot about being the clown, like going and really just being the clown that can, you know, ask all those questions that are sometimes really stupid and really terrible to ask because you feel terrible about it because you don't want to seem like a clown who goes and just asks something without, you know, you want to seem like the person who's reflected on all of these issues, but sometimes being hesitant in that way can also limit the knowledge that you can gain, right? So I think you really touch upon that with your question, the saying that sometimes there's also a good thing about going and then allowing yourself to feel uneducated or allow yourself to feel like the clown somehow. You go and because otherwise you won't be having, I mean, I wish I had the bravery to, in certain situations, just ask the question that I might feel would be a bad question to ask because I should know the answer. And all of this, it can be a terrible situation to be in, but it can also be a really, really fruitful situation to be in if you can learn from that. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I just saw a parallel, I guess. Yeah.
When I did a little research before this talk, I fell across a quote. Somebody said about the whole discussion of cultural appropriation that this is actually a unique learning position for us as modern societies, that these are some extremely important questions to ask ourselves on a society level, but also on a personal level. Are you doing stuff that is responsible to the future of the world? What role does your music play in a bigger picture? It's also about contextualizing, and I think this is something that we can really dig deep into in the years to come. So actually, we should be really happy about this this challenge, so to speak, because it's going to both make a better quality of our music in the future, I'm sure, and art in general, and also as individuals, it's a chance to gain insight.
Ankna, do you have a final comment as well? Otherwise, I will round off.
Yeah, no, I think I've said what I've wanted to say, but yeah, I don't think we can contextualize or explain culture in simple terms. It's just complex and fluid, and I think with that complexity comes the challenge that we all need to take in our responsibility as musicians and artists and performers. Yeah.
And a final comment from me, also relating to your question, Marie, about the guilt thing. This may sound so simple that it's stupid, but I'm going to be the clown then. I think sometimes it's just coming down to realizing that words are not actions, and that's it. Because if where the guilt could appear is when your intention is not linked directly to an action supporting that intention. I hope that makes sense to some extent, but we're so used to reflecting and discussing. But at the end of the day, for instance, if you look at who your friends are, do you have a diverse group around you whom you can learn from in all the interactions you have with them, for instance? So the thing of seeking new environments, seeking new relations in general, I think supports putting words into action on this topic very much. It's always a big responsibility to get the last word. So does anyone want to have it? No? Well, I'm going to survive then.
I just had it in the chat.
Oh, great. Good point, Ankna. And reading more, definitely. But that's also an action. So thank you so much to all of you for coming. I think this was a very interesting talk. And thank you so much, Keld, Nadia, and Ankna, for sharing all your reflections. And to everyone also who asked questions and showed up for this. Thanks. And anyone else who wants to have a final goodbye from the panel? Ankna does?
Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you, Camilla, for organizing this and having us. And again, brilliant presentation, Nadia, and of course for your input, Keld. Yeah.
Great. Well, all of you have a nice day. And maybe panel, just stay on for 2 more minutes so we can say our proper goodbyes and show up for the next ANMA talk session. Take care.